Today we're going to talk about shocks in the business cycle. So the goal is describe the impacts of shocks and sticky prices on short-run fluctuations in output and unemployment, or output and employment. Um, so one of the things that we know is expectations drive a lot of what's going on in the economy. What we expect to happen with our money in the future, what we think is going to happen with prices, all of those things drive what we do today. So, why does it matter? Number one, it impacts what we do. If, as consumers, if we think prices are going to fall in the future, we're going to buy less today. This also affects firms. If firms are more pessimistic about the future, then they're going to invest less today. If they're more optimistic, they're going to invest more today. So the idea is right now in the time of COVID 19, firms are going to be investing less because they don't know how long this is going to last. And um, they want to make sure that they're going to be able to make money off of their investments. The second reason is shocks. Um, Firms have to deal with shocks, which are unexpected situations where they thought something was going to happen and something else happened. And that absolutely describes what we're going through right now um, with a global pandemic. So here's the example. Say a firm builds a high speed train that goes from Washington, D.C. to New York City. They thought it was going to be super popular, it was going to make a lot of money, but it turns out nobody wants to ride it. What do? Do they shut it down? Do they convert half the cars to carry cargo as well? Do they spend another $32 million on a advertising campaign? They thought this was going to be successful, but it wasn't. So how do they kind of pivot and deal with that? So economies have both demand shocks and supply shocks. Demand shocks are those unexpected changes in demand, and supply shocks are unexpected changes in supply. Good example of a supply shock would be the oil embargo in 1973 that caused prices to go way up. Shock only tells us that something unexpected happens. Shocks can be both good or bad. Positive demand shock, demand's higher than we thought. Negative demand shock, demand's lower than we thought. Economists believe that most short run fluctuations are a result of these shocks. Demand shocks. Supply shocks do occur, but they're pretty rare and they are important when they do occur, but really it's demand. And the reason that these demand shocks are so important is because we have what are called inflexible or sticky prices in the short run, meaning prices don't change quickly. Um, so it's not like when all of a sudden there's low demand, prices fall, or when there's higher demand, prices rise. For the most part, in the short run, our prices are kind of stuck where they are. So here's an example. I'm going to use a car company as an example here. So Buzzer Auto decides after they do all their market research, they're going to make an economically friendly car called a Prion. They do all of their data analysis and they figure out they are going to maximize profits if they produce 900 cars per week. And if they produce 900 cars per week, they can sell them at $36,500 per car. That's great because all their research says market demand is going to be 900 vehicles at $37,000 per vehicle. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, Missingberg, that's only $500 per vehicle. But when you're looking at 900 cars a week, that's $450,000 a week. So remember, profit, as long as you're making a penny more than you're spending, it adds up. So they build the factories, they start making the Prions. So here's our supply and demand graph. And we're showing our supply as this fixed output of 900 cars per week. And we've got different demands. Demand M represents medium demand, and that's what we think is going to happen. We got our $37,000 per car, 900 cars per week. DL is low demand, DH is high demand. If all goes according to plan and our demand is that medium demand that we think is going to happen, then we're good. We're going to make profits of $450,000 per week. The factory will never have issues. We're producing the exact right number of cars. If the point here is, if the expectations are always fulfilled, this company is never going to contribute to short-run fluctuations in output and unemployment in the economy. Everything's perfect. But we know it doesn't always work that way. So if it doesn't pan out the way we thought it was going to, if there's some shock, we're going to see some fluctuations. If demand happens that's lower or higher than we thought, we're going to have to make adjustments. Now here, our graph shows that prices are flexible, right? Prices can move, just our output is fixed. So in this case, in the weeks of low demand, we just have to drop our prices and sell each car for $35,000. Now this is a problem because we would take a $1,500 loss on every single car. Weeks of high demand, just sell the cars for $40,000. This basically implies that every single week, this company, Buzzer Auto, could just change the price of their cars. Why wouldn't that work? Well, first off, let's say I bought my car in a week of high demand for $40,000. How mad would I be if 1 week later that same exact car is selling for $35,000? Also, they're not going to be wanting to sell cars at $35,000 and be taking a loss on every single car. So if we take this and apply it to the whole economy, if prices of goods and services could always adjust like this, the economy could always produce that optimum output. There would be no changes in output. There would be no changes in unemployment. But it doesn't work this way. In reality, prices are pretty inflexible, especially in the short run, meaning we cannot and will not charge a different amount. So here, what we see is in weeks of different demand, this calls for a different output of car. If demand falls, we should only be producing 700 cars per week. Demand rises to the high demand, we should be producing 1,150 cars. So now we get to what it actually looks like in the economy. And here's the thing. If weeks of low demand, and we're only producing 700 cars, then we don't need as many workers. We don't need as many resources. And this, if we're trying to change our output every week, it gets really expensive for firms because they're having to change how much how many employees they have, how many resources they're using, how are they producing, and it becomes more expensive, and they're going to have a higher per unit production cost. So one of the reasons that we are able to work with this is by using inventories. If firms continue to produce that optimum output of 900 cars per week, they can, in weeks of low demand, build up their inventory. In weeks of high demand, use up their inventory. Now, inventories are a little bit tricky because what if there are 3 weeks of low demand in a row? Now we've got 600 cars sitting around, and we have to start worrying, okay, should I reduce? Should I be reducing my output now? Should I change what we're doing? Cars are huge, and we can't always do that. So what this tells us is unexpected changes in demand and inflexible prices really are what explain our short-run fluctuations in our economies. If prices were flexible, then firms could always produce that optimum output. But they're not. They're inflexible. So when we have an unexpected decline in demand for any long period of time, we're going to see output fall, unemployment rise, and they've got to produce fewer things. So when we look at the economy as a whole, if demand falls off for a lot of goods and services, which we're kind of seeing right now, uh, we see output fall and unemployment rise. On the other hand, if demand is unexpectedly high for a long period of time, economies boom, unemployment will fall, uh, and and we'll see that firms reaching to fulfill the demands. So what matters here is this price stickiness. Uh, Inflexible prices or sticky prices help explain uh, how those unexpected changes in demand affect GDP and employment. Um, Not all goods have sticky prices. Some of them are very flexible. Things like corn and oil and commodities have to have very flexible prices. Other things like gas is very flexible. This shows average number of months between price changes for different goods and services. You can see at the top, it takes a long time for prices to change in coin operated laundry machines. And the reason why is in this case, every time they change the price, they've got to go in and fix the price, the quarter mechanism for most of them. Um, and that's expensive. So, why do we have short run price stickiness? We're going to talk about this in depth in chapter 29. But a couple things: consumer preference, which I alluded to earlier. We get annoyed if prices change day to day or week to week. We want prices to be stable. We want to be able to know if I have $20, I know what I'm going to be able to buy with that. And then the avoidance of price wars. Two companies, when they lower prices, they think their competitor's going to lower prices and then they're going to have to lower prices and they don't want to do it. So instead, they just avoid it. The last thing I want to get to in this discussion is long run versus short run price stickiness. What we were talking about is we were talking about the short run and the fact that prices were sticky in the short run and they didn't change very much. But in the long run, price stickiness tends to moderate. Uh, Firms that do choose a fixed price policy in the short run, they don't have to stick with it permanently. They can change their prices over time. So here, short run graphs tend to look like this on the right: fixed prices, flexible output. And in the long run, we can get our optimum output as our fixed output and deal with the price changes. We can use our inventories and whatnot to deal with that. So totally inflexible prices on the right is going to be the extreme short run. Flexible prices, fixed output is going to be the long run, and that is the graph on your left. So in terms of duration, the extreme short run is the first few weeks or months after a demand shock. And then the long run is many months to several years. So it all depends on how long those conditions last. We're going to talk more about these in chapter 27 and chapter 29 in the next unit. Um, and we'll look at how this affects aggregate supply and demand.